don't know how to follow that introduction. That was great. Thanks to Adam, thanks to my professors who were here, thanks to the Washington College community just for nurturing me as a student, as a person, as a student of history, and really as a person in the world. I think the description of the things that I do, I think are a frequent occurrence for many students here who take a very big part in this community and try to carry that forward because they want to be involved. I will say, to talk about the great leeway that the Starr Center gave me as a student, I came across this book as I was going through my bookshelf, and it's here on the Chester. It's I think a 2006 publication from the Literary House. And I found my notes from the last time I spoke at the forerunner of this podium, but in this room at this spot. I found my notes from that night, we did a big book launch, but the story I wrote was The Curse of the Rock Hall Ferry, about George Washington's trips to Chestertown in Kent County. And the biography that they let me print in this is a little funny. John Arbor came to Chestertown in 2002 to study political science and economics. As a New Jersey native who believes curses really do exist, Jack is obviously a Nets basketball fan. That's the kind of just fun time they let me have here, and I just can't say more about Washington College and the Starr Center especially. And thank you to the political science department as well. I love these talks as a student. I still think about Peter Wood talking about Winslow Homer more than a decade ago now, for which I did not study for an econ comps test, and I did not do well on it, as Professor Lynch knows. But I'm here to talk about Robert Kennedy today and his journey beyond his brother's life, President JFK. And so the natural place to start is 50 years ago this week, when Robert Kennedy launched his campaign for the presidency. He challenged a sitting president, Lyndon Johnson, his brother's vice president. It's a campaign that was inspiring to many people. And I want to actually play a little bit of sound of Robert Kennedy from that campaign to give you an idea, refresh you on his points. But one thing I do want to point out first is there's a young man blinding his little brother in the right-hand corner of that photograph. His name is Chris Kennedy. Tonight he could become the Democratic nominee for governor in Illinois. And so they're horsing around. But to get back, this is Robert Kennedy 50 years ago this week at the University of Kansas. Oh, we're having a programming problem. Can I get the program volume up on this? Sorry, guys. Mitch?
Change your.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Change your next slide. Give me 1 second.
We could just skip it too.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, we'll skip it. Back to presentment. Okay, so what I was playing there was Robert Kennedy from 1968, talking about the gross national product, how we can't let that be the measure of our progress. It doesn't measure the happiness of our children, the joy of their play. It was a very inspiring message, evocative of change, idealism, possibility. But that is free of context of that political act. And what you must remember at this time, Robert Kennedy's action to run for president 50 years ago this week was rooted in what was felt as a hard-hearted ruthlessness. This is Eugene McCarthy. He was a senator from Minnesota. He wasn't a particularly dynamic fellow, but in late 1967, he decided to challenge Lyndon Johnson for the presidency in the Democratic Party based off opposition to the Vietnam War, which was raging at the time. It was a long shot candidacy. You can see Lyndon Johnson pushing a snowball. It was viewed by places like the Washington Star as not credible and soon to be just toppled over. But that's not what happened. And the New Hampshire primary, 50 years ago this month, McCarthy won about 4 in 10 votes. LBJ, the giant, the big daddy of the Pedernales, was suddenly looking incredibly vulnerable. And this could have been Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy decided not to run. The same people who approached McCarthy were the same people who approached Bobby in November of 1967. And he said no, because it looked too hard. And so the headline on one day is LBJ barely wins. You see McCarthy resplendent. And the next day, Bobby suddenly says, I might run myself. I'm reassessing my decision not to run. And I guess to put it in context for people who didn't live through it, it would be sort of like Jeff Flake challenging President Trump, winning or doing very well in the New Hampshire primary, and the next day Mitt Romney decides he's going to run for president too. That was Robert Kennedy, this person who was viewed skeptically by many people who may have agreed with him politically. And that was something that really followed him every place he went in his life. This word at the bottom of the Boston Globe front page there, ruthless. To quote the Yale law professor Alexander Bickel, Robert was perceived as a tough guy, insensitive, cruel, vindictive, clannish, summed up in a word which he never shook, ruthless. The Kennedy machine, led by Bobby for many years under his brother, the taskmaster, the strong-arm enforcer, swooping in to Eugene McCarthy's, to reap the benefits of McCarthy's bravery. That is the duality of Robert Kennedy, someone who could stir inspiration from people with his words 50 years later, as most people will hear when they look back on this campaign, but whose calculations could be infuriating to people. And this conflict that lived within him, I think, made him who he was. And I wanted to trace the push and pull that shaped his politics and him as a person. And so we'll begin November 20th, 1925. He is born in Brookline, Massachusetts, the 7th of 9 children. He was the son of wealth. The Kennedys were rich in the 30s when others were poor. He was also born into great political power. His grandfather had been a mayor of Boston and a congressman. His father was a wealthy businessman, would soon become the ambassador to Great Britain. And he had a distance from his brothers. He was born 8 years after Jack and 7 years before Teddy. His mother would say he had two much older brothers who were no good to him as playmates, and one much younger brother. So, in fact, he was a kid who spent a lot of time alone. And he later talked about how many schools he attended, saying that it was more than he could really remember, and that he lived in places all over the world, from Hyannisport to Palm Springs to Bronxville to London. So you see this emergence of an awkward, natural outsider from his very earliest days. And this thing that sort of drove him and defined him for all of his life was family. And here you see JFK. This is 2 years before PT 109. And you see Bobby there sort of standing over his brother. In the 40s, his brother Joe was killed in Europe. His brother Jack became a hero in the Pacific. And Bobby didn't really have a chance to prove himself. But he stayed the family course. He attended Harvard, lettered in football, dabbled in journalism. He went to University of Virginia for law school. He married Ethel Skakel in 1950. He was the first male Kennedy to settle down. He was the first to have kids. His father said he was the one who would keep the Kennedys together. And family just drove him, defined him, decided for him. Bobby missed his 1952 graduation from University of Virginia Law School, so he could go to Massachusetts to help run his brother's campaign. And they did very well. They were successful. They won. But Bobby also won a reputation in that campaign as a hard-driving political operative. He got a job in the Senate as his brother went to the Senate, working for Joe McCarthy, the investigator in some communist witch hunts. In 1956, he was always looking to the next political job. He goes to the Democratic Convention and helps JFK in an effort to win the vice presidency, the vice presidential nomination, I should say. They lost, but Bobby joined Adlai Stevenson's campaign in 1956 to learn how to run a national campaign. And in 1960, Bobby worked to the bone. All hours of the day, though he still attended Mass on Sundays. That gives you the sort of sense of his superhuman-esque devotion. His father said that Jack works as hard as any mortal man can, but Bobby works a little harder. And they succeeded as well, again. And Robert Kennedy, having run a campaign, having served his brother for most of his professional life, needed to decide what he was going to do next. And he considered going to England, going back to school to study for a while. But his father said, your brother needs you as Attorney General and needs you in the cabinet so that you can continue advising him and being the one person who has no other interest but your brother's. And they actually tried to talk him out of it. They sent Clark Clifford, who was a famous fixer in Washington, D.C., to go down to Palm Springs to talk to Joe Kennedy Sr., the ambassador, as they called him, and to say, this is the reasons why it's a bad move to put your young son into one of the most powerful cabinet positions. And Joe Kennedy looked at him without malice and said, Bobby is going to be the Attorney General. And so he was. JFK joked that he was going to open the door in Georgetown at midnight, look both directions down the street, and whisper, it's Bobby, close the door. And the story goes that he told Bobby he had to comb his hair before they went out to introduce them. But Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, had a big portfolio. He did foreign policy. He did the crises in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis. He was involved in Vietnam, the early decisions there. Domestically, he was the point person on immigration, the point person on civil rights. And he was indeed divisive. Favor seekers would go see JFK, and this was the way it went through the Senate. JFK would listen to them, they would ask their demands, he would smile and nod, and then he would say, interesting, go see Bobby. Bobby was the one who said no. And it kind of became famous in Washington to say that Bobby Kennedy did it to me. It was a way, I think, of a power marker of saying, the president wouldn't have done this to me. I'm a very important person. It's that Bobby Kennedy. He's the one to watch out for. He's the one who's no good. And Bobby, this took a toll on him. In the fall of 1963, he seriously considered resigning as Attorney General and moving out of the White House and not even back to the campaign because he was afraid it was going to negatively impact JFK's re-election chances. He felt that he was so toxic that he was starting to impact his brother. And therefore, he asked JFK about it. JFK said, no, it'll look like we're running out on civil rights. And so, because that was one of the major issues that was causing consternation in the Democratic Party for the Kennedys. So Bobby stayed. He saw his brother on November 20th, 1963, his 38th birthday. They talked a little while. He went over to a party at the Justice Department that day. He seemed depressed to some of his assistants, but he was going to stay. But then 2 days later, his whole world changed. And President Kennedy was killed in Dallas. And Robert Kennedy suddenly lost a lot of the direction in his life. Millions of people watched him mourn. They saw a person who looked shattered. It was a little bit harder to hate Bobby at this point, and you could see why. He was lost. His whole duty had really been family. and had been prescribed by that. What was I going to do next? What did my brother need? He didn't have that anymore. He cared deeply about preserving the Kennedy legacy, and he told people who served his brother, who were loyal to his brother, to get what you want now, because in 11 months, we won't matter. We'll have no power. It'll be over. And 11 months away was the election of 1964, in which Lyndon Johnson faced his first big campaign. And this is Johnson a few days after the assassination, a few days after the funeral. And the New York Times described Bobby there as one of the most moving sights in that chamber. But Robert Kennedy was thinking at this point, through all of this grief, through all of that tragedy. And I tell a story in the book about 2 days after the funeral of JFK. This young press aide at the Justice Department named Jack Rosenthal, who has since passed away, he spotted Bobby coming in, and he was shocked to see him because he didn't expect to see Bobby really. He wasn't sure he'd ever see him again. Some people thought he might resign. He was shocked, though, Jack Rosenthal was shocked and relieved that Bobby hadn't seen him because he just didn't know what to say to him. But then his boss called him into the Attorney General's office, who wanted to talk about this, the front page of the Wall Street Journal. There was a story, dead center, about Washington under Lyndon Johnson. Hopeful air pervades Capitol as officials buckle down to jobs. It was mostly a glowing review of the transition of power, as unexpected as it was, except for one person. And I'll read this to you. But if some new frontiersmen were overcoming their despair, others were not. A Kennedy appointee at the Justice Department complained, "It's pretty hard to identify with a Texas wheeler dealer." So what Kennedy wanted to know was, who is this person? Because Lyndon Johnson is going to find out, and I want to find out before Lyndon Johnson. So they say, Jack, you talked to that reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Could you give him a call? Rosenthal thinks, sure, I've got to try for anything for Bobby. He calls a reporter. The reporter tells Jack, sorry to say, it was you. He had talked to Jack about the transition to the Justice Department, and Jack used a curse word to describe Lyndon Johnson. And because it was 1963 and it was before we printed curse words in newspapers, they changed it to wheeler dealer. So Jack had to go back in to Kennedy's office and say, I'm sorry to say it was me, sir. And Kennedy said, oh, great, I was worried it was this one assistant attorney general. That won't matter. He won't care about a young press aide doing that. And Jack told me this story because he was curious of why did Bobby care? This is just after his brother's dead. What is he reading the Wall Street Journal for in this review? And it's amazing, but Robert Kennedy immediately after his brother's assassination was thinking of politics. He was thinking of becoming Lyndon Johnson's vice president in 1964. Now that's a shocking sort of thing to think about in context of that 1968 campaign we talked about at the beginning of this, because he was challenging Lyndon Johnson. But at that time, Robert Kennedy saw no other way to remain in power, to protect his brother's legacy, than to seek power through the most conventional means possible. And that was going to the convention of the Democratic Party in 1964 and becoming the vice presidential nominee. Now, how could that happen given the modern era? And must remember, 50 years ago, this was before that succession in power. And I'm glad to have Birch Bayh here tonight, someone who understands the 25th Amendment. But this is the line of succession before JFK's assassination. JFK, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Speaker John McCormack. But after Dallas, this was the picture. And it added the man on the right-hand side there, Senator Carl Hayden of Arizona, who was the president pro tem. And before the 25th Amendment, there was no way of filling a vacancy for the vice presidency, no constitutional way of doing that. So you have a new president and two very old men who are next in line. So the vice presidency was going to be vacant up until the 64 election. And this actually isn't an anomaly in history. It had happened twice in the previous century. We have Teddy Roosevelt and both William McKinley passing away in the beginning of his second term, and Franklin Roosevelt passing away in the beginning of his fourth term. And there was no vice president for those times. So Robert Kennedy received a lot of advice to go to the convention, where LBJ would have the biggest say, but Bobby could sway the power brokers. And in the book is a lot of the day-to-day battle, the week-to-week battle they had for the nomination for influence. One issue I talk about a little bit is the New Hampshire primary, which had a write-in for vice president that year. And it's, that primary that Robert Kennedy would sit out. There's a lot in my book about how Robert Kennedy, I think, was a very active participant in that 1964 primary. But he had to show a lot of deference to LBJ in that year of 1964, that year before the election. There was a lot of question of whether or not he was even going to stay in the Justice Department and serve a president who hadn't chosen him, who was considered his political enemy. But he decided to stay as close as he could. He tried over and over to convince LBJ that he was a team player, as much as they were sort of chemically opposed to each other. And Bobby would privately say in this very year, in May of 1964, he's an animal. He doesn't know how to treat people, doesn't know how to treat the people who work for him. He was very disappointed to see how he treated his staff, LBJ's staff. But behind the scenes, Bobby was working the power brokers. And an aide ran the operation on the ground in New Hampshire to do this write-in. LBJ and RFK clashed over this. The aide publicly resigned, and that story was the story for about a month. But soon the truth came out that it was over this clash with the New Hampshire primary and this write-in drive for Robert Kennedy. Tensions were very, very high. And in this primary, believe it or not, the state party endorsed Bobby in New Hampshire for vice president. They were putting out ads like this for people to take to the polls with them. And for a moment, Robert Kennedy kind of became the top of the ticket, and the sitting president was his running mate in this vice president write-in. The Boston Globe, the political editor there, said it's very likely that Bobby will receive more write-in votes than Lyndon Johnson will in this election. And this led Lyndon Johnson to really panic. And the night before this vote in New Hampshire in 1964, Bobby talked with his aide, Bill Moyers, who's pictured there, about Robert Kennedy's campaign, how he's fighting it out, how he's not even pretending anymore. Johnson talks about the intelligence he's getting from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover about Bobby's movements, talks about a meeting he's having with the Wall Street Journal, all of which check out with Bobby's daily ledger. LBJ, you can tell he's getting real information on his political opponents there. And the night before, in that conversation, and I would play it for you, but it's kind of low and it bounces a lot in the track. LBJ said, well, we could ask him to resign tomorrow. And Bill Moyers decides, I'm going to talk you out of this because that would be really, really bad if all of a sudden the Kennedy leaves the administration. We have to keep this party together for this presidential election. And it's a great conversation to hear because it's like listening to President Trump get talked out of a tweet by a staff member. It's fascinating. But he almost fired his attorney general over this New Hampshire primary, over this battle over the vice presidency. This was all kind of quickly forgotten, not just years later after the presidential race of 1968, but also because the New Hampshire primary of 1964 is remembered where the ambassador to South Vietnam got won in a shocking landslide in the Republican side of the race. And you could sort of see Kennedy down there in the bottom. Kennedy trails Johnson in write-in vote. He did very well. Johnson had got about maybe 3,000 votes more than him that year, but still, you sort of get a little bit of a blurry look, 25,000 votes to a few hundred and a few dozen for others. And Bobby was still the top of the public polling for this. People, rank and file Democrats, wanted Robert Kennedy to stay in the party, to stay in the leadership there. And I have a lot more in my book about this and about what Robert Kennedy did in the secret campaign. He took speaking lessons. He would fly to New York City as Attorney General and take elocution lessons with the woman who taught Eleanor Roosevelt when she was First Lady. He was really trying to break out of his role as a person behind the scenes, as a campaign aide and as an Attorney General, but always a second to his brother. And he inspired a great reaction. This is him in California in June of 1964. Robert Kennedy discovered a new power that he had not had before. This reaction that people had, they were drawn to him. They would pull at him. It was dangerous and uncontrollable. And LBJ understood that, how those passions could really overtake something as fickle as a convention, where there was no set rules, and a demonstration could do a lot. And so here is the 1964 Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, and as a reporter joked, there's the Democratic ticket, Johnson & Johnson. And it's true. LBJ was able to shift the showing of a memorial film to JFK that Bobby was going to introduce to after the balloting for vice president. He picked Hubert Humphrey, who the convention ratified, and himself, so that in case Bobby got up there and inspired a reaction, it wouldn't overtake the convention, which is what happened. Robert Kennedy got a 12-minute to 14-minute ovation where he was trying to speak, and they wouldn't let him speak, and people were stamping and cheering and applauding, and it was that sort of electricity that ran through the room that really could have, if he wanted to, say, I declare my candidacy for the vice presidency, he could have gotten it. LBJ, you listen to his private phone calls, says he's either going for this place or the other place. This place meaning the presidency of the United States. That was the kind of volatility there was in American politics at that point. It wasn't a set deal at those conventions. Robert Kennedy experienced his power. He needed to understand how he was going to wield it, what he was going to do with it, but he had another great interest at the time, and that was his family. He was now the patriarch of his family. His father had had a stroke a few years earlier before JFK's assassination that left him mute and difficult to communicate with. His brother was gone. Most of his older siblings were gone at this point. And so family factored into his decisions. And in June of 1964, something major happened with his family. And there you will see our guest here, Birch Bayh, on the lower right-hand side of the screen, on the front page of the Boston Globe this year. Ted Kennedy was in a plane crash with Senator Bayh. It was a shocking moment for Bobby. The pilot was killed. Teddy's aide was mortally wounded. And Bobby was rushed through the night from Hyannisport across the state in western Massachusetts to the hospital in Northampton, where you see the picture the next day. You get a sense of how much pain Ted was in, which wasn't really conveyed at first. It was not, they weren't sure whether Ted was going to live, actually, at first. And Robert Kennedy there, you see on the right-hand side, is in terrible shape. A nurse said that she had never seen someone so despondent. And he just sort of wandered the grounds of the hospital. And he said to himself, somebody up there doesn't like me. And he decided to rule out this other option that had been open to him at the time very quickly. He said he wasn't going to run for U.S. Senate from New York. And it was possibly an impulsive decision. His brother-in-law, Stephen Smith, had been going around sort of collecting support, knowing that the vice presidency was probably out of their reach at this time. And it was the more practical thing. And so when Johnson ruled out Bobby as a vice presidential candidate, RFK had to think about what his future was going to be. And he, said, I don't really see much of a future for me in Washington, D.C. But he also knew about that power, and he knew that he needed a base of which to operate through. And so a Virginia resident who voted in Massachusetts soon became the Democratic nominee for U.S. Senate from New York. And it was, a convention, no primary. The party fell in line pretty easily. But that was maybe the most difficult part. And you're looking at the 1964 New York State Democratic Convention, which was utter chaos. So here's Bobby. Here's a cold fish and a cold fish. At the Fulton Fish Market after he won the nomination for Senate, he was uncomfortable. You could sort of see that awkwardness here. But the crowds, he could just turn people out. This is Coney Island in September of 1964. And you even see it there. Bobby's a little bit wooden as he speaks. He'd been working at it. But those crowds were also so big that he was hard to hear. It was hard for people to really get his message. They didn't know when to applaud. Actually, Jeb Bush did the please clap thing the 2 campaigns ago. Bobby literally did that. He would say, please clap now. Because it was just more of a thing of an emotional release for people to see him come speak. But people kept showing up, and they kept tearing at him. And you could sort of see a little bit of how they did it. One aide wrapped around his knees, another with his fingers in his belt so they wouldn't pull him in when he was traveling through these small towns. That's a small town in New York. It was grueling. And he had a meeting with his schedulers in that 1964 campaign early on where he's sitting in a chair. The schedulers walk up. They don't recognize him because he's so battered. And he reaches out with his left hand with a pinky. And they notice that all of his hands are all cut up and bruised because people are just going at him. And he says, this is what I wanted to talk to you about. And he said, I can do it, but I just won't be able to think straight. But he was learning that power, makes me feel like a beetle is something he said. And that, the reason he really stood a chance, it was all about these people and this connection with him. What you see in the 68 campaign, you see it first here in 64. I want to talk a little bit about, the other people, the forgotten people in this. And the former colleague of Birch, Senator Ken Keating, a Republican, liberal Republican, walked out of the 1964 convention where the conservative movement really began to rise, Barry Goldwater. He had these pink cheeks and white hair and rosy complexion that made him look like a grandfather, and Bobby said that's going to be very difficult to beat. And he also had a very formidable record. This is one of his campaign flyers. It shows him running 7 times undefeated in some difficult circumstances for a Republican in New York. And he painted Bobby as appointed, rejected, handpicked by the bosses, as someone who wasn't a person of the people. And also, this was very, very important, Bobby's ruthlessness, coming back again. Ken Keating wants to serve you, not to use you. And the view was Virginia resident, Massachusetts voter. Bobby didn't vote in the 1964 election because he couldn't register in time in New York. I mean, that's how quickly he was there. It was, again, this RFK, ruthlessness. I think you see stepping stone to bigger things in this, I don't know which newspaper this is from. And Bobby was bad at the vote for me speech. He wasn't good at getting up there and saying, here's the laundry list of things that I want to do for you. He was very good, though, in question and answer sessions. He needed those sorts of interactions. He had been a prosecutor. He'd done a lot of questions in the Senate hearings. And so they recorded him talking to students, taking really tough questions, like why did he pick New York? Did he walk out on civil rights? Stepping stone again. And they would air these half-hour specials of him talking to people and taking questions, maybe not always saying what they wanted to hear. And it worked for him, and it became this sort of trademark of sincerity that you again see in the 1968 campaign of him telling the medical students, I don't think you should have a deferment any different. I would get into this a little bit. If you want to hear a story about Robert Caro, I'll tell you later. They'd never really had a debate. There was a big sort of fracas there. Bobby was shut out of the room. But it was a Democratic year. It wasn't hard for Bobby to win. LBJ won New York State with 69% of the vote. And to give you an idea of how Bobby was still perceived at the time, not the sort of hero that we remember, he 15% less, 54%, 15 points less, I should say. Bobby joked, now I can go back to being ruthless. He was a freshman in the 89th Congress. Here he is with the leadership and the freshman class of 1965. He was ranked 99th out of 100 when he entered the Senate. He had just gone from being the number 2 man in Washington, some called him the number 1.5 with his brother JFK, and now all of a sudden he's a member of the Senate. And he was a celebrity though there. He was very closely watched, but he went sort of to his old form at hearings. He was tough, he was prosecutorial. The Washington Post did a story about him interviewing the executives of the big automakers, in which they said he treated them like a couple of teenagers who were flunking a driver's ed exam. He used his celebrity for causes, for Appalachia, for education, for the farm workers, for the mentally ill. But he was not a great senator on the merits, on the mechanics of being a senator. Here is a score of his presiding over the Senate. One of these freshman duties, you sit in the chair and you gavel. Bobby had 75 hours, 47 minutes compared to, say, Walter Mondale, freshman that year, had 107 hours. Note from his Bobby wrote a note, I didn't do too well, did I? His secretary wrote back, nope. This photo, though, tells, I think, you a lot of what you need to know about Bobby's reputation, or at least what people believed about him at the time. This is the morning of LBJ's inauguration. Earlier, Robert Kennedy and Ted Kennedy had gone together. They went to JFK's grave, they prayed, they went to the inaugural, they sat for the ceremony, they didn't go to any of the balls, they came back. And Robert Kennedy would pass the Arlington Cemetery on his way back, and he stopped again. And the second time he stopped, there was a photographer there. And they took this photo, and the first time there was no photographer there. And what quoted in anonymously was a senior Republican senator who said, we're a pretty hard-boiled crowd. We notice things like that. What he was suggesting was Bobby used his brother's grave as a photo opportunity, as a way to evoke sympathy for himself. Now, people who knew Robert Kennedy and knew him well and knew his mind knew that that was not true, that Bobby went when the cameras were not there. He went off and was very much grief-stricken. But these were the sorts of things that he had to concern himself with. He struggled with loyalty to his brother's legacy, and you see there they put a bust of his brother in the cabinet room as they made decisions in the Johnson administration, and a table full of people, many of whom had been appointed by JFK, who Bobby had sat with as they made decisions about Vietnam. Robert Kennedy had a history there with Vietnam. He had supported the efforts, but early, behind the scenes, you see in his conversations in the cabinet room, talking to LBJ after he becomes president, stressing a political decision, not a military one that involved all of the people who were fighting, compared to what some other people were saying of just keep going. Robert Kennedy, unknown to many people, in 1964 offered to become the ambassador to Vietnam when Henry Cabot Lodge left. LBJ turned him down, said that it was too great of a risk to lose him. But still, I mean, that shows you the sort of commitment he had to that issue. And he was worried about a public break. But as troop levels went up, he decided he had to say something more substantially publicly. And so in 1966, in February of 1966, he sort of spoke out for the first time, saying this thing about the political decision, letting the Viet Cong have a piece of the power if they were to come together, hold elections, because he felt that you couldn't ask them to just surrender completely. There was nothing to surrender for. They had to have a future. He thought it was rational. But members of the administration saw it the other way. And they came out in full force to trash Bobby's proposal, to suggest it was weak, and they even quoted John F. Kennedy against Bobby, which he felt was particularly low. And he was scored by Hubert Humphrey, who said, this is a prescription for ills that includes a dose of arsenic, called him, saying, let the fox run the chicken coop. Bobby was very much scarred by this experience of speaking out, saying something that he had been saying privately, publicly, and being called ruthless, saying he was using, William F. Buckley said he was using the Vietnam War suddenly to create a new break with Johnson so that therefore he could reap that benefit and start a movement against him. And so it caused Bobby to become much more skeptical about how he was going to go forward. And we talked about the New Hampshire primary in 1968 and why Bobby Kennedy didn't get in, and the ruthlessness of when he did decide to run, when he saw that the break in the party wasn't about LBJ Kennedy, it was about Vietnam, it was about the issues. So in that way, that was the burden. JFK's memory had given him great power with people, but it was also something that weighed on him and his decisions. And a primary challenge to LBJ might have seemed right on the policies, but he knew on the personal aspects, on how it was going to be perceived, it was just too much. And yet, Bobby had gradually shed the constraints that he had from his campaign operative days. He started to see politics not so much as a conventional power game, but as an outside power game. He began to discard caution. He trusted his moral instincts. He embraced a philosophy of change that he felt and saw across American life and across the world as he traveled. And I read about his travels to Latin America and his travels to South Africa. And why did Robert Kennedy grasp this change so well? And I have to say, the only way I can see it is he wasn't a better Catholic after his brother's assassination. It wasn't because he read a lot of Greek poetry. It's because his life was change in the 1960s. He had direction, he lost it. He had power, he lost it. The country was also entering this sort of upheaval, this revolutionary moment. In 1965, he gave these speeches about a revolution now in progress, which was basically saying, this is inevitable. We can shape its character, we cannot shape its outcome. We know what's going to happen. And so Bobby was the leader who could really drive that path. He looked and sounded like the person who brought the America into the 1960s, but he wore the hair of someone who looked like he had learned from it. His political calculations were still intact. He did not get into that 1968 race, but they did soften to another degree. He argued unapologetically for the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. In the past, he had been much more, as he would have described it, respectful to Southern senators' inclinations. But he began to talk about the continuous insult, as he said, that was inflicted upon African Americans in society. If you were serving in Vietnam and you were killed and you were brought back to the United States and brought down to a southern state, your family wouldn't know where they could stop to safely spend the night, to eat a meal, to use a restroom. And so Bobby, understood in a new way, and he was able to reach out and touch people who had suffered great losses. And you were able to see this, and I'm sure we're gonna see a lot more of this in the next few weeks as the 50th anniversary is upon us, of Bobby speaking in Indianapolis on the night of Martin Luther King's assassination, in which he talked about his own loss, and he talked about how we must come together and not turn to hatred. And it was just the same with Robert Kennedy standing up to abusive sheriff's deputies or a racist apartheid regime in South Africa that banned people who dissented. It was this experience that gave him, I think, one of his most passionate words, which was, each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lots of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. And that was Robert Kennedy in 1966. That was the person he was becoming. That was 2 years to the day before he died in June of 1968. He gave that speech to students who were fighting just for a freer and fairer society in their country. So circumstances in politics can lead people to places they did not expect. An aide who went to South Africa with Bobby said, if you had told him 3 years earlier that he'd be standing on a car in South Africa singing "We Shall Overcome" with a bunch of students, he wouldn't have imagined it, but there he was. Robert Kennedy gave his life, his passion to politics. He died in an unrestrained leap to public service, something he felt he had to do. He felt he had to run for president in 1968 in order to preserve his brother's legacy, but also because he felt it was the right thing to do. And he was, though, in the end, a politician and someone who believed it was a noble cause. And I wanted to close with something from what he said when asked by an interviewer in 1965 how he would feel if his sons went into politics, or his children went into politics. And he said, if you ask me whether I would like to see one or all of my children in politics someday, the answer is yes. I would do nothing to influence or push them into it, but I would be pleased if it happened. Politics can hurt badly, but there are lots of other ways of getting hurt in life. So, thank you, please clap. How are we on time? I'll take a few questions, I suppose, right? And I'll repeat them for you, if you have any. Oh, sorry, thanks.
How do you feel RFK hasn't been assassinated with this election, or if he did get elected? Kind of United States history would have played out now, maybe an earlier exit from Vietnam, not the rise of the race,
I have to think there would have been much pressure on him to find some sort of solution in Vietnam, and I don't think it would have gone on, I think, 7 years longer, as far as we had Americans dying there in service, dying there. I think he probably would have been a little bit more disappointing to people. I mean, it's when you die in pursuit of something, it's harder to say what it would have been. And you were left with all of this possibility and wonder. And I think Robert Kennedy probably would have been a president much more like his brother, in that they were still able to make major changes because they had a Congress that would work with them. He probably would have had much more on poverty, much more on education, but Vietnam, I think, would have turned out slightly differently. It's hard to say. There's a great quote, too, about Richard Nixon and sort of the cynicism in American politics that with Watergate, without Kennedy, Humphrey, with Humphrey, Nixon, Nixon, Watergate, and then every president is Nixon until proven innocent. And I think that's the sort of cynicism we've been living with ever since. I'm not sure to say that would have stopped it completely, but there's one thing that would have been different. Yes, sir. Yeah, the question is would Robert Kennedy as president done more to reconcile with China, or at least would the history have gone on the sort of same path? It's interesting. Robert Kennedy, I'm scraping the barrel of my brain here for if he supported the admission of China to the UN. I think he supported direct talks with the Chinese about nuclear weapons at the time, because this was the rises of China as a nuclear power. I think he might have been able to, but there's also the argument, I should have studied more in Asia. I'm looking at Professor Oros. And, I think there's also the argument that only Nixon could have done what he did with the Chinese. It was controversial when Robert Kennedy, he gave speeches about what we should do as far as nuclear talks and things. I think he was against admission to the UN in '66. He might have come in favor of it a little bit later. But that's the best I can answer your question on. Thank you for the question, though, Professor.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk and a wonderful book. One of my favorite moments in the book that I'm still kind of shocked and trying to wrap my head around is the story of Mount Kennedy.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you could share it with those who haven't heard that story. And then also, it happens midway in the book, and it's chromatic in a way, but I'm also trying to figure out how it fits into the rest of the story exactly. So I'll press that question, but really
Sure.
I'm just interested in
So in 1965, Robert Kennedy, as a freshman senator, just a few months into his journey in the Senate, climbed a mountain, the highest unclimbed mountain in North America at the time, Mount Kennedy. I think it's the Yukon Territory off the top of my head. He goes with one of the most experienced mountain climbers in the world. They ascend. It's a very dangerous climb, but they had a lot of luck, too. But Robert Kennedy also had a lot of press for this. And there were planes and helicopters flying around the summit. They were getting daily reports in the newspaper about his progress. ABC's Wide World of Sports covered it. They did a special. It was a Life magazine cover and then an essay. And so he got a lot of press for it. But it was really an emotional thing. Teddy was supposed to go with him, but he was in that plane crash, so he couldn't. It was the kind, though, of challenge that Robert Kennedy was putting in front of him of, I'm going to climb a mountain. And it was, I think, very much part of his character to test himself physically, test the boundaries. And also, it made a lot of vigor. One of the people, Fred Dutton, who became his presidential campaign manager, said, you should be going on trips. You should be doing things that draw people's attention to how young and sporty you are compared to Hubert Humphrey and Lyndon Johnson, who are not. So they go on these dinosaur river mount rafting trips and to take your sons on safari and do all that. That was one of them. I think, we're talking about the photograph of Bobby at the grave. I think people thought, man, he's a camera hog, too. It's Robert Kennedy's fulfillment of another tribute to JFK. A lot of stuff was done with JFK in mind, what President Kennedy would have wanted. They were very respectful and revering. So, yeah, sir.
So you spoke a bit about the duality of Bobby Kennedy's life, where he was a very serious politician, hard-driven, ruthless at times, but also valued family, his faith, and things like that. With that duality coming together, what do you think are one to maybe two pieces of advice that Bobby would offer us today in our current political climate?
I think he probably would have, the one thing he would have said is continue to serve, to try to find a way to do as little damage as possible. Because he saw Lyndon Johnson as somewhat of a destructive president and a person who was inflicting pain upon the New Frontier legacy. Now, there's a strong argument for people who support President Johnson that he was able to execute things that the Kennedys weren't able to and make accomplishments and complete things. I think, but he would have also remembered somewhat civility. I think he would be shocked probably by how politics has become so combative. He was one of the toughest, biggest street fighters there were, as far as politics went for other people. But he did like to have somewhat of a coalition. So, and I think he probably would be also a little bit worried about how ideologically similar the parties have become internally. So, Professor Primo?
Jack, I wanted to ask you if you remember Richard Harwood from the time.
Richard Harwood was, I remember his wife Bee.
Yes.
Richard Harwood was right after my time,
Right after.
right before my time.
The older folks in the room will remember Richard Harwood. He was a reporter and later ombudsman for the Washington Post. And he, on one occasion, told a number of us an anecdote
Oh,
about the presidential bid of Bobby Kennedy in the 1990s. Richard was assigned by the Post to cover Bobby's campaign. And after, I think about 8 weeks, Richard informed the Post that he could no longer continue reporting because he was no longer objective, that he had been so swayed by Bobby's appearances throughout the campaign. I always thought of that as a very seminal moment for Mr. Harwood, but also I think it reflects on what you've been telling us in many ways today about Robert Kennedy's ascendancy and the way he developed, and I think political aspirations that would have become quite likely a reality.
he was a very,
I always remember Richard Harwood and his candor and admitting that he could, and Richard was not the person who was swayed.
he was a tough reporter, and he had a reputation for being a tough reporter. Bobby did inspire loyalty in people the closer they got to him. Many reporters loved him very dearly, and when his brother died, were very much trying to get him back into the arena and cheer him up. But Richard Harwood, shortly before Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, a disturbed person in Oregon tried to attack him. Richard Harwood was one of the people who wrestled the man to the ground. I think he had a knife, I believe. And then I think it was not long after that, just before the assassination, Dick Harwood said, "I can't be objective about this race any longer." And I remember, I'm not sure it's still there, but Dr. Shad had the poster, I think that was Dick Harwood's, from that campaign in his office over in Goldstein for a while, at least when I was a student here. The 68 campaign was an exciting time and an emotional time, and a lot of change happened in America in a very quick succession. He launched his presidential campaign. 2 weeks later, Lyndon Johnson removed himself from eligibility for another term, though he was eligible. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. There were disturbances in cities all across the country. And the Vietnam War, some of the worst weeks of the Vietnam War were in the spring of 1968. So it was a time of great unrest in the United States, and it only got worse, really. Adam.
Jack, before we wrap up, I wonder if you could say something about your senior
Oh.
captain, your senior thesis, and how it grew into this.
I'll defend it.
12-year journey.
So, I had this sort of shocking revelation today. I graduated in 2006. Politics was kind of boring. This was before 2000, even 2007, 2008, the Obama-Clinton, primary, where they went all the way. I'm talking about how my thesis turned into this. And so I looked at that year, 1968, and I said, wow, politics is really exciting. And here are these three people who sort of all kind of came together, and they're all very different: Robert Kennedy, Cesar Chavez, and Martin Luther King Jr. And so I decided to write about these three people in 1968. And it was really more of a history thesis than a political science thesis. I then discovered these two Senate aides. In my reading about it, I was just sort of interested, Adam Walensky, Peter Edelman. And I discovered that they had left these long oral histories. I went back and read them. There's about 1,000 pages each. And I wanted to write about them. I'd spent some time with them. And then I realized that there was this period in Robert Kennedy's life. And one of the interesting things about the book is the cover. This guy, Steve Schmidt, who also took the photo on the campaign poster you saw earlier. This photo isn't from the '68 campaign. You see very small in the corner, you probably can't see it, but it says Pat Brown. Pat Brown was running for re-election in 1966 in California against a washed-up actor named Ronald Reagan. But this is the kind of reaction Bobby was able to inspire from people. This isn't like a parade. This is just a motorcade, and you got that sense. Robert Kennedy was this big figure. Chose these little guys, and I discovered just this story from right after his brother's death, and that whole vice presidential experience to how do you become Robert Kennedy in 1968? And the story had been told a lot of the campaign in '68 and that whole decision period, and I really wanted to get deeper into that period right before it too, to bridge that gap, that valley in between the mountains of his life. And that's really, I started working on it, night shift. Watch Morning Joe, please. So, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be back.